Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar series that the Beyond Health Hack team has organized. My name is Chi Huang, and I will be your MC for today. On the behalf of the Beyond Health Hack organizing committee, I would like to thank all of you for spending your evening with us on this webinar session leading up to the Beyond Health Hack that will officially start on the 7th August. Before I begin, let me introduce to all of you my amazing team for the event today. Me, I'll be your MC for today. Rustam, the moderator. Sorry guys, a bit of technical issues. All right. Okay, Rustam today will be the moderator for the event today. He will be in charge of sieving out the questions that you all pose to us. Musa and Junqi will be the publicity head as well as the technical team to support all the technical issues that you all might have encounter during this webinar session. Okay, so for the benefit of everyone who are not part of the Beyond Health Hack, let me do a short introduction of the Beyond Health Hack. Beyond Health Hack is a virtual hackathon session whereby pharmacy and medical students from all over the Asia Pacific region come together to engage in an intensive brainstorming session to generate ideas to tackle one of the pertinent public health questions, which is the influenza vaccination uptake issue. The burden of influenza is real. Every year, there are an estimated 1 billion cases worldwide, out of which 3 to 5 million of the cases were severe. Influenza can have serious complications, especially for the vulnerable population such as the elderly, those who are immunocompromised, and people with pre-existing medical conditions. Studies have shown that the risk of heart attack is increased by 6 times, and the risk of pneumonia is increased by 100-fold. Inarguably, influenza vaccination is one of the most effective measures in controlling the spread of influenza. However, due to a lack of awareness of the impact of influenza and the lack of adequate national guidelines and policies to govern its use, there is, in Asia Pacific region, the influenza uptake rate is way below the World Health Organization recommended 75% vaccine coverage in at-risk groups. Therefore, this hackathon aims to provide a platform for young healthcare professionals of tomorrow to think critically and out of the box to develop cost-effective and sustainable solutions that can help to increase influenza vaccination uptake in the Asia Pacific region. In order to equip our participants with the necessary knowledge regarding the topic of influenza and to provide them with some inspiration, we have arranged a 3-part webinar series for the upcoming days covering a range of issues regarding medical technology, infectious diseases, latest insights into influenza, its impacts, as well as the current effort to control and mitigate the negative impact caused by influenza. Today is the start of our first webinar session featuring Dr. Mark Stybik, who will be sharing with us a framework and walk us through the thinking process behind each medical innovation and breakthroughs. For the purpose of the hackathon, we are not expecting our participants to come up with novel, ground-up technology-driven ideas or prototype, but rather solutions that leverage on the potential of existing technologies. This framework that Dr. Mark will be sharing with us later on will be helpful when analyzing a technology in its suitability for problem solving. In his speech later, he will be covering 4 main aspects, namely solution, innovation, regulatory, and scalability. Every good solution originated from a rigorous root cause analysis, identification of existing problems, and well-defined outcome measures to measure the effectiveness of the solution. Innovation, which is not just creating something new, but also about being creative enough to utilize the existing technology to help to solve problems that we encounter in our daily lives. And in this case, help to increase influenza vaccination uptake. Next up, for regulatory and scalability, Dr. Mark will explain the feasibility of a solution from the legal and business perspectives. These perspectives will range from issues such as data collection, how to determine the class of a device, market competitiveness, and as well as patents. Lastly, Dr. Mark will be doing a short live demonstration on how to pitch your ideas to your judges. I believe that everyone here is keen to learn from our guest speaker today. So let me introduce Dr. Mark Stybich, who will be the speaker for today. Dr. Mark Stybich is a founder and chief scientific officer at the Xenex Healthcare Services. Xenex uses a patent-powered xenon disinfection system to make patient care areas safer by reducing microbial contamination. Xenex has also been featured in Forbes, CNN, and other media outlets, as well as in peer-reviewed scientific publication. Dr. Stybich specializes in creating efficient solutions for public health problems. He received his doctorate training from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and has been involved in multiple international research and intervention projects. He is also an inventor on over 80 granted patents and a principal investigator on an NIH grant. He is also a fellow at the Infectious Diseases Society of America and chief epidemiologist at the Forefront Healthcare. After Dr. Stybich's sharing, there will be a Q&A session for all of you to ask Dr. Stybich questions. So do take note of your questions that you want to ask. Now, we would like to welcome Dr. Stybich to start his sharing. Yep, Dr. Stybich, to you.
Excellent, thank you. Let me share screen here. I don't see share screen. Ah, there it is. Okay, one moment. And all right, we are ready. So first of all, hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I want to make sure to thank the organizers. It's been a pleasure working with Beyond Health, and it's great to talk to so many students in the Asia Pacific and region. And I'll also note that it's about 6 a.m. here in the US. So I've just had my coffee. I think I'm all ready to go. So what I want to start with before I get into the slides, first of all, I want to encourage everyone to send in your questions. So please be writing down or thinking of questions as we go. There's over 100 people on the call, so we should have plenty of questions, and I will leave time for that. And any questions I don't get to, we'll be able to see. I'll be sent, and we can try later. I'm going to try to open my camera. I lost the widget for that. Let me see. Where is my camera?
We are unable to hear you.
Can you guys open the camera? Oh wait, here we go. Got it. It says I can't start video because the host has started it. So happy to do the camera, but I can't open it myself. Okay, so what I want to start with is the Xenex story. So the story of what I did and why I switched from kind of academics and into technology. And so what Xenex is it's a germ zapping robot. It uses a pulse xenon UV to disinfect, and that's what we started with. And we had the kind of core technology. It was used in other fields, and we were able to adapt it to the field of hospital-acquired infections. And that was the main goal of it. Why I like tech, so the company was founded, the mission of the company is to prevent the suffering and deaths caused by infections. So it's a mission-driven company. What's been really interesting to be in tech, as opposed to research in other fields that I've been in, is the speed at which you can do things is really fast. And so if I have a research question or something I want to look at with that involves the company, I can fund it directly and we can move very, very fast rather than waiting for grants and other features and other, other funding mechanisms. So tech moves very, very fast, but there are also some other challenges, of course, to technology. So what I want to do is go through some of those challenges, some of the things you should be thinking about if you're thinking about a technological solution to a problem. So I'm going to start with the first slide, which is the scale of medtech. And this is kind of what I was speaking about before, is medtech is huge. It's giant, and there's lots of funding available. And if you look at some of these numbers, in the US, $200 billion going into medtech every year. So it's just an incredible amount of money. And that doesn't count, that's just the development side of things. Like there's all the billing and everything else. There's even more, when you look into the healthcare sector, it gets even larger for all of these regions. The other point I want to make, though, is what makes medtech really, really challenging is that last bullet. Every year, there are 40,000 patents filed. So that means there's 40,000 new ideas, 40,000 concepts that come out and are brand new, or someone thinks they're new and they're willing to put, patent costs at, I don't know, maybe $10,000 to file. And so someone somewhere thinks these ideas are new, novel, and that makes it really a crowded space. And so getting to that point of having a new idea, something that's truly new in medtech is a challenge. So what I'm going to do is present a couple categories, talk through how I think about the categories, and then give some examples. So the first one is the solution, so the technology. And when you think about it, these are four really important questions, and especially these are questions that an investor, potential investor, might ask. And the first is really defining the problem. And it's not so much defining the problem, in a big global fashion, but defining it with great precision. So, for example, in my case, the company was Xenix. We have a germ zapping robot. It produces UV, a specific high intensity UV, all of that. But that's essentially what it is. What often happens is someone will develop a technology and go look for a problem. And that becomes an issue in trying to get the tech and finding a fit for the technology in the business world. So in my case, the problem isn't, there are germs, or, we're going to focus in, we're going to hone in. And it took a while. It actually took a while for us as a company to learn, we had this technology, but what was really the problem we were solving? And in the US, that problem was C. diff, our Clostridioides difficile. It wasn't all germs, it wasn't all pathogens in the environment. What our technology was able to do was reduce the amount of bacteria and viruses in the environment on the high-touch surfaces. But where the hospitals really cared about that, and where the chief financial officer really cared about that, was this idea of Clostridioides difficile, which at the time was ramping up in the US, and it was also becoming a reimbursable issue. So the hospitals were getting financial penalties around this. So, but really defining the problem. So in the case of vaccine uptake, what portion of that, if you're looking for a technology solution, what portion of that really, really big problem is this getting at? And it is a question of very, very, very precise speech around this. When you write your problem statement to get that. So what I would really encourage you to do is to write that with as much precision as you possibly can. Don't let this be a general statement. Don't let this be a sort of global statement, but get very precise at what you're trying to solve. The other one is then, of course, what is the solution? How does the technology address that problem? Once you get the problem statement defined right, this will flow nicely. And one example I think of is when I'm doing grant writing. So back in the research world, at least with the National Institutes of Health here in the US, and I imagine it's similar in most places, there is a one-page summary of the grant, no matter how big the grant is. It could be, millions and millions of dollars for the grant. There's always one page, and in that one page, there's a little brief introduction, maybe a paragraph, and then there are the specific aims. And in the specific aims, you're writing precisely what that statement is. Who are you going to test, everything goes into this one little sentence, and it can take weeks to get the sentence right, because you realize if I state the wrong test population, well, then my test methodology doesn't suit anymore, or vice versa. So again, I encourage you, as you're thinking about your problem and solution, to be very, very precise. And then, of course, the biggest question is, do they match? Often I've seen with technologies, solutions without a problem, or solutions that actually solve something else, but the person pitching the technology hasn't put all the dots together yet. For example, if I would have taken the germ zapping robot that we have and said, this is the solution for, say, Pseudomonas infections, which have some environmental implication, but they're also not so environmental, it would have been wrong. Like, yes, my solution can disinfect Pseudomonas in the environment, but that's really not what it is. I'm really solving a different problem. And so being able to make sure they really, really match is really important. So whatever your solution is, take it back to that very precise problem statement. And you have to ask the very hard question is, does this match? And you have to be willing to say, no, actually it doesn't match. These aren't a match. This isn't a fit. Something else is going on here. And you keep thinking about it and thinking about it. The last question, and this is a good question from investors, like, how do you know? How do you know that your technology is going to work? How do you know that you're going to solve the problem? Is it just sort of theory? Is it the mechanism of action? Have you actually, is there data out there? Is there data that you can point to? You can say, well, a similar technology or similar solution worked in this setting, and therefore I know that this will work in this other setting. Or, a similar solution addressed the problem in some way, but by adding this one component, I can match the missing piece. There has to be some sort of dialogue or explanation about how do you know that your solution is really going to fix that specific problem. And in the case of the hackathon here, that's going to be looking at other research and other similar solutions or other similar situations. So, but that's a huge important piece of it, is knowing that it's going to work in the field in real life and moving that. So a couple examples, these are all from my experience. So the first is a project called Gobi Wave. And the Gobi Wave project, I will say, was one of those examples of the mismatch between the solution and the problem. And this was a program I was involved with in the early 2000s in Mongolia, in outer Mongolia. And it was a Gobi Regional Economic Growth Initiative. And basically the idea was to help the economy in the Gobi region. I was involved on the health aspects of it. A lot of the programs that were designed, kind of before the program launched, were a lot of training, a lot of education about, the transition from communism to capitalism. All of this was the sort of the structure of the program, fairly predictable in a way. And we go out and we're doing the trainings and all that, and it just doesn't feel right. Like, here we are in the rural Gobi Desert, and we're doing trainings on like economic systems. Like, it was just total mismatch. But what we found as we investigated more, we asked more questions, we talked to more people, we found this very, it was kind of elegant in how simple it was. But there was a radio tower that broadcast on shortwave radio that reached the entire Gobi Desert. And it usually just played the standard Mongolian radio program from the capital, from Ulaanbaatar. And what we learned, though, is what we could do is switch off that signal, and then we could broadcast not only educational material over the radio, which reached every single individual in the Gobi Desert, and they all had these radios, but we could also broadcast pricing. And the simple act of broadcasting the price of cashmere on the border to China, that's where everyone had to sell. That very, very simple technology, we gave mobile phones to reporters on the border. They called in the daily prices, and we could tell the herders the daily prices. And they could then do their calculations to figure out, is this a good time to sell my cashmere or not? Very, very simple intervention. That ended up being, a use of technology and a very simple, low-cost way to solve the problem. Whereas education and training and like capitalist systems and things like that, we're not able to do that. Another example of a great technology, but that at least in healthcare, I feel is drifting around right now, is this idea of hydrogen peroxide vapor disinfection. So the basic idea here is you have a system, you roll it into a hospital room, an operating room, and it fills the room with a fog that contains hydrogen peroxide vapor. And that vapor then disinfects. It actually works fantastic. It disinfects the surfaces in that room very, very well. However, it takes about 2 to 4 hours and costs about $200 per room. And so the technology works really well. It was well developed, but the solution that it was being pitched for in the US, and this is one of our competitors at Zenix, the solution it was being pitched for, at least in the US, to disinfect hospital rooms was a mismatch. It took too long, and that company did not do enough of the research ahead of time to know that the operations officer in a hospital would say, absolutely not, you cannot delay a room for 2 hours. I have to get my patients in. I have to get patients out of the emergency department and into that room. So the technology worked really, really great, but it wasn't really addressing the problem. And then an example from Zenix that is also a consideration. So, you have to consider the technology, you have to consider the problem, you have to consider all of the different stakeholders there. So in the case of the hydrogen peroxide vapor, one of the important stakeholders was the chief operating officer who basically kind of canceled the technology. For Zenix, matching the payer and the user has been an issue. So the end user is the housekeeper, the environmental service worker who's operating the robot. The person who's paying at the hospital is the chief financial officer. That's a big mismatch. So we have to design a product that not only delivers the benefit to the chief financial officer, or the business case for the product, but we also have to design something that the end user likes to use and prefers to use. Because if we make the CFO happy, but the end user dislikes using our technology, it's going to sit in the closet and not be used. So we have to match every single stakeholder that is involved in the solution. So in the case of Zenix, that's the chief financial officer, the quality officer, infection control, the environmental service worker who's using the robot, and typically the nursing staff who, if anyone's workflow is disrupted, it will be their workflow. So thinking about all of the different people who will be involved, who the solution will disrupt or interrupt their way of doing their work, and then figuring out why do they benefit, each of those individuals. Why is this a benefit to, in my case, infection control? Well, we're going to try to reduce the rates of infection. Why is it a benefit to environmental services? Well, we go through and we do a lot of training, and they're suddenly using a high-tech tool, whereas before they were, they maybe felt that they were disconnected from the hospital and from the healthcare teams, and now we're bringing them in there. The CFO benefits if the rates of the certain infections go down, then their penalties are less. So going through every single stakeholder for any solution, whether it's technology, policy, and figuring out how are they impacted by this, and how could I make sure that that technology or that solution is a benefit to each of them, that they like it, that they want to support it. Next one, this one's actually really hard. Innovation, and that first question there is it really new? So whatever solution, whatever technology you're looking at, has someone tried it before? How do I know it's new? And what's actually very, very difficult to say is what is novel about it, and I use the term novel very specifically here. So we look at is it really new? So can I be sure that no one has tried my solution before? Or if they had, what have I adapted or changed to make my version of that solution better? And that's usually more of what happens. Like, again, 40,000 patents a year. It's really hard to find something that's truly brand new. And so what you're going to find is, your idea is going to fit into, there's going to be a history around that topic, that solution, that technology. And what you want to do, the story you need to be able to tell is what you've changed in that, what's happened before. So in my case of the germ zapping robots, there were other UV disinfection was well known. If you work in a lab, a pharmaceutical lab, any lab, like you have a UV light in the hood. It's been known for decades that UV can kill organisms. What's new about the device I have is the power, the way we produce the UV, the intensity of the UV, and the speed. Why does that matter? Well, that matters because that's the exact problem that the technologies have had. That the older technologies that go into a hospital room, they take too long. They take 30, 40, 50 minutes to disinfect a room that we can do in 5 or 10 minutes. Why does that matter? Well, now all of a sudden the chief operating officer is going to be able to allow the technology to work. Like before, if we said we had to delay something 30 minutes, an hour to 3 hours, the chief operating officer would say, absolutely not. You cannot use that technology. But now we're within a window that they say, well, okay, now you can use it. And so now we have an opportunity. So what's really new here, isn't the big idea of we're going to bring in a germ zapping robot. But what is new is that germ zapping robot is something that can be operationalized in the hospital, which sounds really, really boring because it's not an exciting technology thing. Oh, it's operationalizable. The chief operating officer likes it, but it's critical. And so figuring out what the problem with the solutions that are similar to yours, but the problems they had before, and then solving those problems are really where the right line of intervention works. Because there's some experience in the world, it failed for some reason because it hasn't been widely deployed. And then you've come up with a way to solve that piece. So I'd encourage, a form of innovation, again, 40,000 patents a year, a form of innovation is really looking at other innovations that have failed and then solving that problem. Why did they fail? What went wrong? Another big challenging category is what I would call status quo, or what is the current solution? So what's happening now? What's wrong with it? And why? What have you done? What is, for your solution, what's better? How has your solution improved the current solution? Why does that solution exist right now? Why hasn't that developed? Why is it stuck? Why, whatever's happening now in the world, there are a lot of smart people out there in the healthcare environment. Why has this not developed? Whatever you're looking at, whatever technology policy that you're looking at, why is it stuck where it is? And what have you done? What is your idea to make that better, to change that, to accelerate that? So this is all part of the story you need to be able to tell to basically pitch your idea. And the last question comes back to, what is the data that already exists there? What are you basing all this information on? Are there studies that point to, why a system failed, why a technology failed, what were the problems? Are there reports, anything you can get your hands on to construct the story? At least in the US entrepreneurial world, and in my experience in Asia Pacific as well, because we have robots in Singapore and Japan and South Korea, Thailand, and we're kind of expanding rapidly right now. Kind of anywhere in the world, a story is very important, but to be able to tell the story of, we saw this, here were these problems, we had this, here's how we fixed it, here's how that all comes together in a quick story is super important. And once you get there, to have that story flow, it's worth the time to take. Again, going back to this idea of precision, it's worth the time to take to make sure all of that is flowing correctly and makes sense. And I'll give an example at the end here. So some examples of innovation. One of the things that drove me crazy and I didn't understand as we went into Medtech, as I started in this field, is the really terrible, awful user interface on much of the equipment, like this pump here, and not to pick on this monitor, and not to pick on this monitor, but you've got equipment like this all over the hospitals. They've got rotating dials and buttons and nested menus. You have to press menu 6 times and then the up arrow twice, then menu again, and then you can change your setting. There's just these like really terrible user interfaces where all of this should be, if it was up to date, it should just be a touch screen. It should be super easy. You tap on the number you want to change. It's just there. And I didn't understand that for a long time, but now I understand it. And it's because of the regulatory issues. And so if I design an IV pump, so this pump has to be really incredibly reliable. And it has to, put out the correct dose over and over and over again. It has to alarm at the right times. And those pumps were designed, some of them even in the 1980s, they're old. And the user interface on them is awful. Again, nested menus, it's just terrible. But if that pump company wanted to change the user interface, they would have to do this huge regulatory process to show that the new software controls were, at least as reliable, if not more reliable than the current controls. And the reliability standard for something like an IV pump, a medical device, is very, very high. And so there's companies look at it as like, well, if we went and invested in all of that to create a great user interface, in the end, the nurse would love it, but it would cost more than our competition. So that process, it would take years to go through the regulatory process. And in the end, they would make a product that they maybe couldn't sell. And so we're stuck with this really bad user interface on a lot of equipment, because it's already a known and established and approved and functional user interface. So if my solution, say I was addressing the problem of, just nursing time flow, trying to make nurses workflow easier, more efficient, I would come up with a great solution that sounds great to change the user interface on these devices, and then I'd run into these problems. So you've got to go through the whole process, like who else is involved in the technology. And here's a case where an innovation, changing the user interface, actually runs into an unexpected challenge, which is this regulatory environment. And the other issue I want to bring up is when we look at patents. So I've filed quite a bit of patents. This idea of novelty is very strange, because you think you've invented something. No one else has ever done it before, and you file a patent on it. And I've had some things, so, my patents are around environmental infection control. And I've had things cited against me by patent examiners that you would never expect. I've had a portable closet cited against me. I've had a agricultural silo where they store grain cited against me, like saying, and basically what the patent office is saying in these cases is like, what you've invented isn't new, it isn't novel, it isn't an invention, even though it's a device to disinfect something in a hospital, because over here in the agricultural sector, we see a silo, this giant, storage facility, and it has these features that to the patent office look the same as the features you're talking about. So again, this idea of novelty is really, really tough, 40,000 patents a year. But what you can do is, look for improvements, look for, what's already in place, small changes to that to improve it, and then look at the benefits of those changes. That's can be a very productive way of thinking. So I talked briefly about regulatory, and I won't spend too much time here because it's a huge world, but you need to know who regulates your technology. So, and it's not just one organization. There isn't a single organization to answer this. So for example, our germ zapping robot, which is essentially a light, produces a high intensity ultraviolet light, is regulated in the US by the Federal Trade Commission. So that group looks at our advertising and whether our advertising and whether we're making false claims, making sure we have data for all the claims that we market. We're regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. We're regulated by the Health and Safety Administration because there's UV being produced and we have to make sure it's being used safely. We're regulated by the FDA sometimes, not exactly, but we have to talk to the FDA and make sure we're following their instructions and everything else. So that's the Food and Drug Administration. We're also regulated more from a business legal side by product safety. So we have to make sure our there's a CE mark or UL mark on all of our products and all that testing. And then there's organizations that I'll call kind of pseudo-regulatory or sort of partially regulatory. They don't have authority, but they're important. In our case, the Centers for Disease Control, the professional societies, they'll be writing their thoughts and opinions on these types of devices. So there's just this huge group of people who are kind of third parties that are somehow either regulating directly with a legal authority or having some sort of say in our market sector. A good question is, what kind of device is it? There are 3 to 4, depending on the country, classes of medical device based on the amount of risk and the claims around it. To know for each of these agencies, what is the pathway? that's important because that will factor into your timeline. So if you have a technology that needs approval of the FDA equivalent, those regulatory bodies, that timeline can be 2-3 years. A product safety timeline could be just in months, 2 to 3 months, to prove that, to show your product is safe, it won't explode or catch on fire or cause any problems. Some of the other organizations, like the professional societies that might be involved, the safety societies, the safety agencies, those may need different data sets. Those are usually very data driven. And then, but what it comes down to, and I think what's most important in the short term, as you're thinking about a product and solution, what are the claims you need to make? And this is really important because most of these regulatory agencies will act on your marketing claims. So if I have a product that I claim will, cure the flu, that's a huge level of claims. If I want to have a claim around, reducing the risk of infection from the flu because I'm disinfecting surfaces, that's a different pathway. It could be the exact same product. And so it's not necessarily the technology itself or the solution itself that drives the regulatory pathway. It's what you're claiming the solution does. And I think that's an important distinction, because again, going back to the germ zapping robot example, if and there are about 14 studies on this, if it's used in the correct way in a hospital, it's used in the right places at the right times, we've seen reductions in the rate of infections. However, that's not the claim we're going to make. We're going to make a claim around reducing bacteria in the environment. And those are very different claims, exact same technology. But if I say the first one, if I say I'm reducing infections, it's a different regulatory pathway than if I say I'm reducing bacteria in the environment. So the claims drive the pathway. So think about, for your solution, if it is going to be regulated in these ways, what is that claim you want to make in marketing? Because that will drive your pathway. And then when you think about regulatory, there are 3 main categories that come up. And I just mentioned these because some of them are a little unexpected. The first is product safety. You have to show that the product is safe, both in terms of its electronics, but also in terms of what it does in the environment. Is it putting people at risk? Is it delaying anything in care? So product safety is one thing. Design controls is not to be underestimated, but it hopefully isn't relevant in the beginning, but all of the engineering around a product is regulated. And so everything around the product is regulated in terms of your supply chain. How do you know that you're making what you say you make? What's the quality systems in place? And the last, which is what everyone really focuses on, but in some ways the easiest, is the performance data. Does it do what you want to claim? Does it achieve that? So just last category here is the scalability. So when you think about scaling a solution, these are some questions to consider. So one is, who's going to pay for it? So in order for something to scale, there has to be investment in it. There has to be sustainable revenue, whether that's a policy, even a training program, or a device. Like someone ends up paying for it. And going back to what we talked about in the beginning, is matching who's paying to who's benefiting is important, or making sure you have a good understanding of the benefit to who's paying. And so in my case, again, in the hospital, the CFO was paying, but the benefit only comes not with any organism where infections are prevented, but only certain ones that have a reimbursement issue. As we expand from the US to other countries, this question is actually a challenge for us, because in a situation where, in a national healthcare situation, the beneficiary is the national healthcare system. However, the purchaser of the equipment is still the hospital. So why would a hospital buy a piece of equipment, pay money for a piece of equipment, where the benefits passed up through to the system? And trying to figure out ways to match that are very, very important. Another big question is, what is the market size? How big is their potential for scaling for your solution? And again, this is not the broad solution or the broad problem of vaccine uptake, but it's the specific problem that you've designed your solution for, the subset of that larger problem. A question investors will often, or potential investors will often ask is, in 3 years, what percent? So we think the market is I'll make it up, $100 million in a specific country, but what kind of penetration can you get in 3 years? So you might say, well, I get, 10% of that market in 3 years. So you're going to be 100 million a year. 10 million a year. Okay, now we're starting to see how the business is going to grow and what potential is. These numbers need to be realistic. One question I like is, at what percent of the market do you need to make $100 million a year? If that's, if we're talking like big med tech kind of solutions, but really thinking, what is the size of the market that your solution can fit into, and what percent do you need to get to certain benchmarks? And then you can look at the scaling to other countries, to other geographies. You can look at scaling your solution. Maybe it fits other problems. All of that's part of it. But in my experience, at least, investors or potential investors look only at the concrete. They look at the, sort of a 3-year window, 3 to 5 year window. They want to really see the possibility there. And then again, who pays for the solution, how does it organically grow as it scales? So as it grows, what is the revenue streams to fund and sustain that solution? Again, so thinking about scalability, what is the plan for growth? What data is success? So, and again, in my case, the data that was absolutely critical for funding the company was reductions in C. diff, or affecting C. diff. And another question to think of is, how do you exit? Investors will be asking about that. Is this a company that is going to be acquired someday, or is it a company that's going to, exist on its own and eventually go on the stock market? And in both of those cases, and this is my last really big point, is what do you own? What does the company own? For example, if I have a solution that is software-based and I design software to accomplish something, you've got to ask the really hard question, how easy it is for someone else to just design that software. If a large company, if you start proving out a market, showing that this new solution works, how easy is it for someone to copy that? If I design a device, is that device engineering? Is it something that a good and competent engineer or a team of engineers with enough time and money could recreate? Or is there something unique inside that device, something patentable, something that can be owned and owned only by the company, by your company, your solution, whatever it is? That is tremendous in terms of seeing the value of a product or a solution from an investor standpoint, that it is unique and it can be owned, separately. There's something there that's concrete. Okay, so that's kind of a big overview of some of the ways, to think about medtech, some of the questions to think about for technology solutions. I think many of these apply to, policy solutions as well. And then the last thing, again, I'll encourage and kind of go back to this idea of precision, is you'll know when you have it. You'll know when you've got your problem statement and your solution all figured out, when you could do the 30-second speech, when you can get the whole thing communicated in about 30 seconds. And it's challenging. And when I first heard about this as an entrepreneur coming from university and everything else, I thought this was crazy. I thought, how can you possibly get any decent idea across in 30 seconds? But it's a challenge, and it's a great exercise because it will force you to be precise. So in my case, the 30-second speech for Zenix, this is kind of before coronavirus because it's changed with coronavirus, but I'll do the before coronavirus one, is that, over 2 million people every year in the United States get an infection from coming to the hospital, which costs $30 to $40 billion a year. We have a robot that can disinfect a bathroom and a hospital room in 30 seconds. I'm sorry, in 5 minutes. And we have data that shows that not only reduces the amount of bacteria in those rooms, but reduces those infections. The average return on investment for a hospital is at least 6 to 1. So that's like the whole picture. We state the problem precisely. We state what our solution is, how it fits in, and we state the result and the data we have. So being able to get your thinking that tight is super critical to presenting, and also to just making sure all of your pieces are fitting and you don't have an issue or a problem in there. And that is where I will stop, leaving some time hopefully for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mark Steinbich. I'm sure that what he shares actually give all the participants a brief overview of the solution, innovative, regulatory, and scalability aspects of your solution. So make sure that the solution, there's no mismatch between the solution and the problem, taking into consideration different stakeholders. And moving on, the important concept that Dr. Mark bring up is that every year there's 40,000 patents that's being rolled out. So innovative is not just about coming out something new, but also be creative enough to modify existing solution, find loopholes in the existing solution, and look for improvements that can potentially be catered towards your problem. And next up at the end, you actually, Dr. Mark actually talked about the regulatory and scalability of a solution. So when you're designing a solution, do take note of the potential regulatory barriers. For example, like advertisement, you need to know what claims that you're making regarding the safety, the design, the performance data. Yeah. So to sum up, I hope that everyone will have a good insights into the Medtech briefing. And now we will open the floor up to actually question and answers. Yeah.
Okay, before that, Chi Huang, thank you so much. I would just give a brief introduction of what's going to happen. So what happens is that Dr. Mark Stavik actually went through with us the kind of technological framework, the style of thinking behind technology. So what happens is that we only have around 10 to 15 minutes left. So for our Beyond participants watching this webinar, Dr. Mark is also a mentor for the Beyond Health Hack. So should we be unable to answer your questions today, feel free to direct them to him as well via our Google form. Now, there's definitely a lot about technology that we have shared today, and I think our participants have plenty of questions they would like to ask. So please feel free to write it in the Q&A, but please keep it brief because we would like to run through them quickly as well. Now, before anything, I would just like to exercise my right as the moderator, as some sort of moderator's prerogative, and kickstart this conversation with a question of my own, Dr. Mark. So with your presentation, you have mentioned a lot actually, but my question is, you touched briefly on software solutions. So what if the solution, for example, mainly involves information technology, being data-driven? How do you think the barriers mentioned earlier may be skewed in terms of, let's say, regulation, the data required, and for example, the product safety?
Right. So software is, a tricky spot, and what seems to be the way to become, the leading solution in a software area is just users, like being the one with the most users. It seems to be the main factor. From a regulatory standpoint, privacy is a big issue, and making sure privacy is going to be protected for all of the different users of the software. And I think the other big piece that I've seen, at least with medtech software and healthcare software, is being able to integrate. Nurses, doctors, pharmacists, everybody is dealing with software all day long, and to have to go onto a new platform or a different platform is a big challenge. So figuring out how to, I think, to find a solution that solves a unique problem, but then can be plugged in essentially and integrated into software that's already being used and become part of the workflow of those professionals is really critical, because asking them to do more doesn't go well. So being able to integrate it in as much as possible, I think, is a big thing to consider.
Thank you so much. I think that is actually quite of a holistic answer. And because of the lack of time, I'll just jump in straight to the next question as well. We've actually received a long list. So the first one is from group 23, and they have kind of asked, this is not really specific to medtech, but it's more of a general question. Now, for any new piece of technology, it would face objection as the target market doubts its function and safety. So what can they do to gain the trust of the market when, let's say, the company knows much more while the public remains skeptical? And how would you go about it different if it was a policy by the government as a solution? So
my thoughts on there is it's actually the most low-tech way to do that, which is relationships. So finding people, either whether they're not so much like there's a whole key opinion leader part, but that's more about the content, but really finding people and users and letting them and getting their stories about using the technology, to reduce the fear. Often with our stuff, our tech will do demos, or even, you know, we'll loan the robot for 2 weeks, and just it gets over all of these objections and fears by people just using it. Whereas, you know, no matter how much I tell them or talk about them or show them videos or anything else, it's an abstract concept. So often just direct experience and then relationships and that sort of word of mouth help with those, especially for new technologies.
That's actually a very fascinating way to look at it, because I do believe that every time we introduce a new technology, a lot of people kind of think of new and innovative ways to how do we bridge this gap of understanding. Yeah, but you mentioned from your experience as a veteran, sometimes the low-tech way is the way to go. And I think for our participants, well, it's kind of like a new insight. So perhaps you might want to tap in on that in your solution. Now we'll move into the next question as well. Currently, there's some intersection between consumer tech and medtech. For example, I believe the term for it is health tech and wearable tech as well. Fitness trackers, wearable monitoring devices. And with COVID-19, there has been an increasing demand for such home health services. And these lines will further be blurred in the future. So how do you think medtech will be redefined in the future? Or will it be simply subsumed under simple consumer electronics?
That's an interesting question. You know, we're seeing more and more of the regulatory path, which is one of the biggest barriers to the consumer tech, easing up. Like I'm wearing a ring right now that is predicting my COVID risk, which is pretty amazing. So I think we'll see more and more consumer tech, but in the end, like some of the components of medtech are so specific that it'll remain its own sector, I believe. But hopefully we'll see some of those innovations. Hopefully the regulatory bodies will be able to get around some of the issues like the software and user interface issues I spoke about. But really where to watch here, I think, will be the regulatory bodies. If they make their changes, I think the medtech field will borrow from consumer tech quite rapidly.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer as well. So really due to the lack of time, I'll just move on to the next one as well. All right, so this is a question on how to engage software people. I believe like IT consultants and that side, based on formulating applications or technology-based model and health perspectives as students. Okay, so I would just redefine the question as well. I believe the question, the essence of it is kind of how, as students, can we engage IT engineers or more of the IT world to kind of take us seriously and to focus more on using their technology and those type of models in sort of enhancing health perspectives.
So one thing I've been amazed by, as you know, because again, I'm coming from the academic health field and all that, moving into business, but I'm amazed how if you show people the service component of what you're doing, if you show them the benefit of their work, and for example, we've had all sorts of supply chain problems during COVID, but if we call up our suppliers and say, that little piece you're making, that little, you know, cable array or whatever it is going into a device that's going to be used in a hospital to try to reduce COVID, all of a sudden they get really motivated by that. And it gives them a lot of meaning and purpose in terms of the work they're doing. So I would say if you talk to IT people, if you talk to, you know, device people, technology people, and show them what you want to do, like explain the problem. Vaccines, you know, in this case, you know, vaccine uptake, flu, why it's a huge problem, and then ask them for the help. Make them feel part of that solution, make them feel part of solving the problem and that benefit to society. You'll find people who are really engaged and will do amazing things for you.
Right. I think that definitely, if you think about it, that's definitely the way that you would approach this question. Now we have another one as well. I believe this one would be a bit more direct. Now, this is actually referring directly to your slides as well. You mentioned a good solution that leverages technology, solves the issue by matching the payer and the user in such a way that it's not like you are force-fitting the technology into the problem. But how do you quantify this suitability in terms of let's say, a matrix, or in terms of quantification of numbers, actually?
I think the biggest challenge there will be looking at the payer And one example I often give is, when you think about their agenda and what they're concerned about, and how do you get their attention? So and an example we give to our sales team is like, if within our company, we're all running along fine, we've got our plans, we've got our software in place, and someone comes and, we're using, say, Salesforce or some, software management for sales, and someone comes and tries to sell us a new software. That's not even on our agenda. We don't even have a problem with our software. We're fine. We've trained everybody. We're not interested. That software could be so much better, but we're not going to be interested. So I think what you want, if you can ask an objective question to those payers, what are your concerns? Where are your problems? And then see if you match any of those. That will tell you a lot. So for example, in the US, when we started the company, the Medicare, Medicaid payment system hadn't put in penalties yet for hospital-acquired infections. We couldn't even get a meeting with the CFO. But then in about 2010, 11, 12, they really kicked in. All of a sudden, we're getting the meeting. And so that might be one thing, is if you have your pitch and you try to get a meeting and they're totally not interested, well, that's an indicator, unfortunately. But trying to figure out what is their priority. So you can go on their websites, you can go on, there's all these professional societies, there's journals for the different payers, there's conferences. What's on the agenda at a conference? Just look at a conference, the topics that are being spoken about, and is something there that's a fit. That'll tell you a lot about what they're thinking and what their world's like.
Actually, I'd just like to inform our viewers that due to the lack of time, we'll be answering only 2 more questions. And should you have any more questions, please feel free to message our registration team as well, and we will collate and send the best questions to Dr. Mark to answer after this. Now, the 2 questions we have are a bit more fun, I would say. I would start with the more fun question, actually. This was actually posed by one of our group members, I believe. Now, the question goes, according to you, would you consider traditional games or app games as a suitable medium for educating people?
I love gamification, like taking any, especially behavior, and even my, personally, I think yes. Even I have a running app, and I get little badges, for different accomplishments, and that's motivating, and it works. So I think there's a lot of research out there on gamification for behavior change. And I think it does work. What I'd like to see more of, and I think as we look into healthcare, a lot of the behaviors we're seeking to change are collective or group behaviors. And I think, group gamification is a really interesting area of how do we get a team together, motivating team behaviors, something as simple as hand washing on a particular medical unit. So not just individual gamification, but how do we motivate team or group behavior? I think is really interesting.
Yes, indeed. I think you brought up a very good point. Like, we have seen a lot of gamification, even within the healthcare community. But now that you've mentioned a collective gamification, I think that is something that still has a lot of room for improvement, in fact. And it might be a point to consider as well in this competition. So that's a good point to raise. Now, our last question for the night. However, if you do have more questions, please feel free to send them to Dr. Mark. We still have our Google form, and I believe we have sent it out already to all our 33 groups. Now, for the last question, it's a bit more personal, I would say, but it's a good question nonetheless. Now, as future healthcare professionals, future pharmacists, future medical professionals, could you give us tips on how to network with the payers, consumers, engineers who will work with us? After all, being in the healthcare profession, we don't really get to meet these sorts of people.
So, in my experience, people are pretty open if you have the kind of a very specific inquiry. So most of my, including this, my participation here actually is weirdly LinkedIn. So people, that might be a good way to connect with people. You can, for researchers, it's a little easier because you can look on the article and then you can see who the corresponding author is, and then you send them an email. But even then, people like to be contacted, and especially if you show a little bit that you know about their work. Why are you choosing them? Make it personal. It's not a blanket email. It's, something very specific. And you know, you'll get a lot of no's, and it's not always fun, but someone might just come in and be interested in sort of a mentor capacity. So you know, for me, the format that works, that is generally LinkedIn, and also finding, you know, giving some thought to why you want to connect with that person and what that conversation will be like, and giving them some idea of what you're looking for, so they know if it's a fit or not. I think is really good. But it is a challenge, but I've found people pretty open, especially in the entrepreneurial kind of tech sense of things. So if you mention you're part of a hackathon and you want to learn more about something, that might you know, get them a little excited.
I believe what Dr. Mark is saying, that he's very happy to link with anyone and network with everyone here as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Happy to do that.
So
too.
if everyone has any good question or you would like to talk to Dr. Mark further, please do so. I do believe he's very happy to interact with all the participants here. Now, I would like to apologize for the slight overrun, but after this, if you have any other question, as I mentioned, please feel free to ask them. This goes out to our Facebook viewers as well. And without further ado, let's move on to the closing address. Chi-Huang, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Rustam, and thank you, Mark, Dr. Mark, for your insightful sharing. All right, so I believe, wait, let me share my slides. Wait, give me a moment. Dr. Mark, can you stop sharing first? Yes, thank you. All right. So I hope that today's sharing, everyone has benefited for today's sharing and gained a lot of valuable insights from Dr. Mark's sharing. So hopefully the sharing today will give you some insight and spur your innovation as to how to integrate technology and as well as other aspects of things into your solution. All right, so now actually I would like to introduce, as I said in the earlier section, this is actually a three-part webinar series. So today is the mark of our first webinar series, and coming up next will be on the 31st of July. So featuring Dr. Liu Nam Ho and Professor Yolanda and Mr. Kim Shamson. So on the 3rd of August, it will be Dr. Jerome Kim who will be sharing with us about the barriers and the future of vaccination in Asia Pacific region. All right, so once again, I would like to thank Dr. Mark Stuyvik for spending the time with us today to share your experience and your knowledge in working in the medical technology field. So as Rustam has said, if the participant, you all have any questions, please feel free to email us and we will be happy enough to send the email to Dr. Mark and to answer your questions. All right, so this marks the end of today's webinar session. Rustam, do you have anything to add?
Not really. In fact, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming down, especially for the Beyond Health Hack participants. This is, in fact, the very start of your journey. And it will be a very, very long 2 weeks, but I think it'll be very fruitful for all of you if you take the chance and reach out to as many mentors as possible. I have nothing else to say, actually.
Yes, thank you everyone. Thank you everyone for coming. Yeah.
All right, Thank you. That marks the end of the webinar session.